Even when a suspect left federal employ, the pursuit continued.
Unfortunately, perhaps some of these people sitting in their offices in Ottawa were not aware of the reality of what actually went on. But what actually went on was, in very many cases, was that somebody did leave under a cloud like that, went off, tried to get jobs in various places, and kept finding that the RCMP kept appearing to helpfully inform their employers that this person that they had hired was perhaps somewhat suspect. And then they would find that they would end up being bounced from job to job and always being pursued in this way.
This is part of the 6,000 Canadian soldiers who recently left Seattle for the Korean battlefront. Many of these troopers of the 25th Infantry Brigade Group are veterans of World War II. They're off to join the Prince.
In the early 50s, the Cold War turned hot. Each week, our moving newsreels showed an expanding red menace. Anti-communist fervor peaked in this Gallup poll, a guarantee of public support for the RCMP's hunt for concealed enemies within.
At that time, the special branch of the RCMP was a fledgling organization and not terribly sophisticated, staffed largely by people who had entered the RCMP to become policemen, not to become agents of a security service, and were largely lacking in formal education. We love to believe, as Canadians, that we're always fair players. Fact of the matter is that in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we were chasing communists, both officially and unofficially. And while we're doing it far more discreetly than the McCarthy types in the United States, effectively, we were out there.
By the 1950s, although the Communist Party was legal, its influence was in decline. Stalin's monstrous deeds had become public. Its members were leaving. But worry over the communist threat was never stronger, both here and in Washington. An obscure senator from Wisconsin named Joe McCarthy vaulted into the limelight by exploiting the communist fear.
We've got to dig and root out the communists and the crooks and those who are bad for America. Yeah. Where you have a committee.
His tactics of smear and innuendo gave the English language a new word, McCarthyism.
If he does, I'll make you one promise, that Leavenworth won't hold them, Mr. Huey.
The hearings degenerated into a surreal circus. Congressmen liked targeting celebrities because it guaranteed publicity. Even Marilyn Monroe got into the picture because her husband, playwright Arthur Miller, was an accused Red. One congressman, a committee chairman, ignored his own crusade against communism and offered to let Miller off the hook in exchange for a photo opportunity with Marilyn. Miller refused. Canada's liberal governments of Mackenzie King and later Louis Saint Laurent were appalled by McCarthyism. Canadian anti-communist initiatives would remain top secret and exclusively under government control, the responsibility of the security service of the RCMP. But the U.S. pressured Canada to pursue communists everywhere. The security panel's policy applied to persons working for government or for defense contractors. But the RCMP began to target employees in all federally funded agencies, even those without the remotest connection to national security.
No, I didn't know about it at all. In fact, never even suspected that I might be on somebody's shit list. And it never occurred to me that I might be you know, beyond the pale, because I was born a Canadian. I feel Canadian. I don't have any revolutionary tendencies. I don't want to blow up anybody or anything. So the whole idea of being a security risk was almost laughable. I had been hired by the CBC to be a producer-director, and I was told after 6 months they would make me a producer-director. I worked as a floor director for the first 6 months, and after those 6 months went by, I said, gee, what's happening? So I went up the stairs to speak to the supervisor. I said, what's happening? He said, you're going to make me a producer. Nothing's happening. I said, I'm still on the floor. I said, well, frankly, Leo, we got a bit of a problem. I said, what's the problem? He says, well, you may be a security risk. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you seem to have belonged to a communist party in the past, and you may be a security risk. This is a government organization, and we've got to be very careful about who we promote. I said, but I don't belong to that party anymore. I'm not a communist anymore. He said, well, we've got to have that cleared. I said, how would you clear it? He said, well, we can arrange for you to meet with the RCMP, and you have a discussion with them, and if they're satisfied, then everything will be all right, and we'll make you a producer. I went down to their headquarters. I think it was near Cecil Street in Dundas at that time. And I had an interview with one of the police officers. I don't remember his name. And he sat me down, and we spoke for about 4 hours. He kept questioning about my background, what newspapers I subscribed to, what newspapers my father subscribed to, what newspapers my mother subscribed to. Why did my father belong to this workman's circle? And was it a socialist organization? I said, no, it's just a group of people who immigrated to Canada who want a burial ground. And they're staying together. They're not communists, they just want a burial ground. Anyway, we went on this way for some time, and he kept asking me about the group, who was in the group. And I told him, as I'm telling you, I couldn't remember, because it happened so long ago, it wasn't really a part of my life anymore.
But isn't CBC supposed to have an arm's length relationship with government? Isn't there such a thing as free speech in broadcasting? Why would he have to be submitted
There's all
to
those
that kind of
beautiful and
blacklist?
wonderful things in our pluralistic democracy. And there's also a certain degree of watchfulness during the period of the Cold War. And essentially, this guy fell into that crack. And essentially, if he were perhaps a little wiser, he would have dealt with the issue much earlier on than when he did. He did. He went forward, demonstrated to the RCMP of the day that ultimately he posed no problem and no threat, and he walked away from it, and then he carried on with his career, and he did fine.
It hit me as a surprise that this was going on, because I didn't suspect that my country was as bad as the United States. Now, I'd heard about McCarthy, I'd been following the hearings about McCarthy, but there hadn't been much of that in Canada. We're not very open about our prejudices, we're not very open about our hostilities, we're intelligent enough to hide them. And so, at that particular time, I had no idea that all this was going on.
Why couldn't we have told these people they were on a blacklist? Why not be upfront about it?
In retrospect, we should have been more forthcoming in that regard. I agree with you. The essence of it all is that we weren't operating that way. Employers weren't operating that way. They are operating perhaps with a hidden agenda almost every time with each one of these particular Canadians who were of any kind of a security concern. And it worked out to the individual Canadian's detriment, except in those instances where they discovered what the cause of the problem was, and they went and they dealt with it and they confronted it head on. They usually won.
I knew in my heart how I felt about things. I feel very happy, for instance, being a Canadian and living in a free country where you can speak your mind, as I am now. Everybody at that time, during the McCarthy era, during the McCarthy hearings, was scared. And I remembered back at those times, and I said, yeah, I remember. There were university professors who committed suicide. There were actors and writers who were banned and blackballed by advertising agencies. Hollywood excommunicated a number of people who were prominent in their field. And it was just a rotten time.
Amazingly, even musicians fell victim in 1951 to the same American blacklist that kept my father from boarding his plane. Bassist Ruth Budd, a former member of the Toronto Symphony, told me the story of the Symphony 6.
I think I'm not a dangerous person. I know I'm not a dangerous person. I hadn't any intention of overthrowing anything. I had been in a trade union in Vancouver because I used to work in the shipyards before I came to Toronto. I had been active in that union, and I had also been active in a youth group. So, but it was wartime, and I felt my job was to support the war effort. And that's what I was doing with all the energy that I had at that time. In 1951, I was playing string bass with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. The orchestra was about to go on tour, including some places in the United States, Detroit for one, and 6 of us were refused border crossing cards. So we therefore couldn't go on that trip. We had no indication that this was going to happen, and we couldn't imagine why it had happened. After we were refused entry into the United States, we still played in the orchestra for the rest of that year. And it was scandalous, you know, the treatment that some of the people in the orchestra, I think out of fear, they were afraid to be seen with us, they were afraid to be talking to us, and it was unreal. I remember going into the dressing room once, and I overheard one of the women saying, well, she must be a communist, you know, she reads a lot. The next year we were refused our contracts. We just didn't get contracts to sign. Of course, we weren't going to be quiet about it. After all, our jobs were on the line. The press picked it up, and people rallied around us. It seemed that the United States was actually dictating who would play in our major symphony orchestra. I don't know why management didn't support us, but they didn't. And the worst blow at the time was the fact that our union didn't support us. So I felt very upset at the time, and for years afterwards, I think it had a major effect on my life.
Years later, the climate changed. Ruth Budd was rehired and played 25 years for the Toronto Symphony. After her retirement, she founded a new orchestra, the Senior Strings. What was it that incriminated innocent people? Since there never was any official reason, it could be anything. In my father's case, it might have been the left-wing Yiddish newspaper to which he subscribed. Did they find him guilty by subscription? We never did find out what made a Montreal tailor so dangerous. But paranoia was everywhere, a sense of fear that, when I look back, was fueled by Cold War tensions and government propaganda.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do.
Duck and cover.
This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration.
Sometimes the bomb might explode without any warning. Then the first thing we would know about it would be the flash. And that means duck and cover fast, wherever you are. There's no time to look around or wait. Be like Bert. When there is a flash, duck and cover, and do it fast.
He ducked and cover. Duck.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
This is an official civil
Newsreel footage of the bomb became a recurring image of the 1950s. People watched it play again and again on the national news, heard talk of nuclear fallout, radioactive contamination, intercontinental missiles, and felt compelled to act.